Hello, so this is your video on the eruption. There's a lot of content to get through. I'll let you know that now. This video will probably be quite a bit longer than the 10 minutes, so let's just get started. So with the eruption, you've really got to start with thinking about, well, how do historians know what happened when Vesuvius erupted in AD 79? And really, there are three key sources of information that modern historians have used to piece together what they think happened when Vesuvius erupted. So these three are, first of all, ancient written sources. The second is archaeological evidence. And the third is looking at volcanology and other examples of volcanoes that are similar to what happened when Vesuvius erupted. So, the first of these I mentioned is written evidence. As you can see here, the only surviving eyewitness account of the eruption is written by this man here. So he's commonly referred to as Pliny the Younger. However, as you can see here, his proper Latin name was actually Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus. And he, while not at Pompeii or Herculaneum, did actually witness the eruption. So you can see here, he was actually at Misenum. If you have a look at your map, you'll get an idea of where that is. And he describes the view that he had from Misenum, and also talks about his uncle who went to have a closer look at the eruption and ends up dying on the beach at Stabii. So Pliny is a really important account because he was close by the eruption and he documents something that he saw firsthand. However, it is important to note that he doesn't actually write about this, or at least not in a form that we have surviving today, until 25 years after the eruption. So definitely something to keep in mind. We'll be looking at this more in class. So just for now, have a think about how we might be able to check the reliability of Pliny the Younger's account of the eruption. So the second source is archaeological evidence. You can see here one of the main sources on the eruption, which is human remains. Studying the human remains can actually tell us quite a lot about what happened in the eruption due to how we think people died. And of course, as you can see here, we've got the stratigraphy. Studying the stratigraphy of the site has also helped scholars get an idea of the breakdown of the different phases of the eruption and get an approximate idea of how long each phase might have lasted and the different areas in the Bay of Naples that were affected by each part of the eruption. And the final piece of evidence that we can use is what's available through volcanology. So volcanology is the study of volcanoes, and scientists have used what they know of volcanoes, particularly drawn from other eruptions, to see how that might be applied to what happened with Vesuvius. So what you can see here is the eruption of Mount St. Helens. That's in Washington State in the USA, and this is from its eruption in 1980. And a lot of volcanologists have actually drawn parallels between this eruption and what Pliny describes in his letters. So a lot of the information to follow about sort of the narrative that historians have built around the eruption ties these three things together. And when you see the images of Vesuvius that have been kind of reconstructed, how they think it erupted, you'll see there's some similarities with this image here. If you're interested in seeing some footage of Mount St. Helens eruption, that's a really interesting link, gives you a really short overview and some video of what these kind of eruptions look like. So just before we start, just a reminder that This topic is cities of Vesuvius, Pompeii and Herculaneum. And so you need to really remember and keep in the back of your mind all the time that these are two very different cities, different sizes, different types of people lived in them. And you really need to have clear in your head the differences between these cities all the time. As you'll see throughout the rest of this video, the eruption affected Pompeii and Herculaneum in very different ways. So again, just keeping in your mind that they're different. When you write about them, don't just say Pompeii and Herculaneum. In that way, you're kind of grouping them together, and essentially people tag Herculaneum onto Pompeii. You really need to discuss the differences between the cities, and make it a big deal of it, because that's how you're going to show the marker that you really know your stuff. Okay, so the first place to start, I suppose, is with the date. So you can see here, I've given you the date 24th of August. But this is actually a date that has been questioned in recent times. So traditionally, when you read a book on Vesuvius eruption, they will give the date as the 24th of August, being the day that the eruption started, with the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum destroyed early on the 24th. That date was provided initially through the letters of Pliny the Younger, and Cassius Dio says that the eruption was towards the end of the harvesting season. So it's traditionally been taken that Cassius Dio is actually supporting what Pliny says. What's really interesting is a paper that was produced by Umberto Pappalardo in 1990. So he actually says that the August date is wrong, and that there's a lot of evidence to support a date of October to November being more likely for the eruption. So the evidence that he provides for that is the kind of fruit that's been found in shops in the city, particularly in Herculaneum. He says that the wine that would have been produced from the October harvest has already been produced and sealed and was found at the site. And also that a lot of the plaster casts at Pompeii show heavy garments, like kind of clothes people might wear in colder weather, and that, 24th of August in this part of the world is actually quite hot. So they're the cases that he's presented for that. With the clothing thing, some historians have said if it was dark and you're escaping a volcano, you might wear a cloak. So it's certainly not a foolproof argument, but it was quite an interesting one to be made at the time. And since then, in 2006, Greta Stefani published a work which looked at numismatic evidence, which you'll remember means coin evidence, found at the site. And what she says is that some coins have been found which are denarii, and they celebrate the 15th time that the Emperor Titus was claimed imperator. And that actually took place on the 8th of September, AD 79. So while that's not concrete, it's possible that the coins were produced before he was officially proclaimed imperator for the 15th time. It certainly does pose questions. And in terms of discussing the eruption, it's important that you show awareness that while the date is traditionally given as the 24th of August, this is by no means concrete. Okay, so before we begin the quite scientific look at the eruption and what is believed to have taken place, here's some of the key glossary terms for this dot point of the syllabus. You'll probably find it gets quite confusing the way that people talk about pyroclastic flows and pyroclastic surges. So please do make sure that you know the difference between them, and that you add these terms to your glossary and make a point of learning them. If you try and learn the new terms as we go through the topic, it will become second nature and not quite so difficult when it comes to having to write on this topic. Okay, so what I'm going to give you on this video is what's generally accepted as the narrative of events. So the dates here are using Pliny's account of the 24th of August, and a lot of this work, or a lot of this narrative, I guess, comes from Harold Sigurdsson, whose name you can see there. So he's from Iceland, he's a volcanologist, and he's looked at those three sources of evidence to say this is what we think happened when Vesuvius erupted. So the first thing that he talks about are kind of the hints that there might be something about to happen with Vesuvius. When Vesuvius erupted, it hadn't actually erupted prior to 79 within living memory. So as far as the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum were concerned, it was a dormant, inactive volcano. However, there were these kind of clues that today volcanologists would say this means something's probably likely to happen soon. So first of all, there was the earthquake, which you've already learnt about in AD 62. So these earthquakes can be a really good indicator that volcanic activity might be going to happen within, the next sort of decade or so. We've got when Vesuvius erupts. And we have a lot of evidence of the earthquake in terms of buildings that were damaged and were still being repaired when Vesuvius erupts in 79. Secondly, you've got further small tremors around about 4 days before the eruption. And there's also records of some springs and other forms of water drying up beforehand, which again, volcanologists would see this as a hint that there might be some activity about to begin. So when we talk about the eruption, you always talk about there being two phases of the eruption. And the first is referred to as the Plinian phase. You might have guessed that that's named after Pliny because he's the first guy in history to ever describe this kind of eruption. So the Plinian phase lasted for approximately 18 hours and produced a rain of pumice, which you'll know what that is from looking at the glossary on one of the previous slides.
It rose to a great height, on a sort of trunk, and then split off into branches.
Okay, so the quote in that video is from one of the letters of Pliny the Younger. And you would have noticed in that video how the top of the volcano appears to have exploded. If you have seen the very famous fresco of Bacchus, with Vesuvius in the background from the House of the Centenary, then you'll notice that that's what Vesuvius used to look like. After the eruption, if we can go back here, you'll see that it has this kind of concave top. With this eruption, the pointy top blew off, and of course it doesn't look like that today. So in the late morning of 24th of August, if that's the date we're accepting, a number of small explosions were supposed to have been heard. So volcanologists would have recognised these as phreatomagmatic explosions. Again, that's in the glossary. And these are caused when groundwater seeps down through the volcano and interacts with hot magma. So this would have led to a very fine ash coming over the sides of the mountain, and it's believed that these drifted in an easterly direction, leaving about a 5 centimetre deposit on the ground over a distance of 20 kilometres. And we've got a quote here from Sigurdsson suggesting that this is, your typical hint that a large volcanic eruption is imminent. So early afternoon, the video gave it as midday. It's usually said to be between about midday and 1 o'clock. Vesuvius erupted in the way that we saw in the video. And Pliny the Younger gives an account of the gases coming out of the volcano looking like an umbrella pine. So this is an image here of an umbrella pine. They're very common in the region. This one's actually at Pompeii. And it gives you an idea of the shape of the cloud that Pliny is describing in his letter. And that's the quote that he gives there.
A black and dreadful cloud, broken with rapid zigzag flames, revealed behind it variously shaped masses of flame.
So what's really interesting at this stage in the eruption is that because of the winds that were around at the day, actually only Pompeii was really affected by this early stage. The winds kept the pumice and the volcanic debris, the ash, away from Herculaneum at this stage. Even though, if you think back to your map, that Herculaneum was much closer to Vesuvius than Pompeii itself. So in this image here, you might recognise this one. You can see the caption in the corner. This is what people believe the kind of pumice fall and ash would have looked like. So during this period, white pumice began to fall on Pompeii, but as I said, not on Herculaneum, even though Herculaneum was only 5 kilometres west of the crater. And this layer of pumice began to really accumulate at Pompeii. So they think, according to stratigraphy, that about 15 centimetres an hour. And as a result of this, after about 6 hours, buildings began to collapse under the weight of the pumice. And again, if you've been watching the documentaries, if you've seen Pompeii the Last Day, they give a dramatic example of what that could have looked like.
You might hear the shrieks of women, the screams of children, and the shouts of men, some calling for their children, others for their parents, others for their husbands.
So the next time that Sigurdsson gives us is around about 8 p.m. in the evening. It is important to remember that these times are approximate. They're a best guess that's been drawn from the evidence available, but they are essentially still a best guess. So from around 8 p.m. that night, the magma composition changed to grey pumice. We heard that it was white pumice before that. And by the early hours of the next morning, so we're looking the 25th of August, the pumice was discharged at 150,000 tonnes per second and carried to heights of perhaps 32 to 33 kilometres. So this really brings us towards the end of the first phase, the Plinian phase of the eruption, and by the end of that phase, Pompeii lay under a cover about 2.8 metres deep of pumice. Again, this is Pompeii that's really heavily affected during this first stage. Because of the winds, Herculaneum hasn't really had any of this thus far. This diagram here is just a really good visual of the change from that white pumice fall to the grey pumice fall. It's interesting to note where the victims are. We'll discuss that later on in the video. So you're probably wondering what all the people were doing while this first phase of the eruption was taking place. Well, at Herculaneum, it appears that a number of the estimated 5,000 inhabitants had read the early signs and escaped by sea. The evidence for that is a lack of boats. that have been uncovered from the site. However, we don't actually know if any of those, let alone how many of them, actually reach safety. Speaking about the boats, this building along the side here, you can see the archways next to each other. These are referred to as the boat houses. These would have actually been located on the beach in 79 AD. You might find that confusing because there's clearly no water here. It's important to note that when Vesuvius erupted, it did actually alter the coastline. So this section here where you can see mountain actually would have been ocean in 79 AD, but the eruption changed all of that. And Pompeii, it's believed that many of the inhabitants of Pompeii, which remember was about 10,000 people, many of those people are believed to have fled during the first pumice fall. And again, the evidence for this is the absence of horses and other similar beasts that could be used for escape, either riding them or drawing carts or what have you. In front of the tradesmen's entrance of the house of Menander, they've found a cart packed with wine jars that was left behind, and it appears that at the last moment that perhaps animals had been harnessed and ridden away, but there's been a large number of family pets left behind. You'll probably see a fair few casts of dogs that hadn't been taken with families as they were leaving. So while a fair number of inhabitants of Pompeii were believed to have fled, what we don't know is how many actually made it to safety. The ones who left at the first pumice fall, so right at the beginning of the eruption, may have had time to actually cover enough distance, but the increasing fallout and the confusion of darkness would have made it very difficult for people to escape. So unfortunately, while some may have escaped the city in time, actually escaping Vesuvius itself might be another question. So just a reminder here of the distances that we're looking at. So you can see the umbrella pine shaped cloud. You can see how close Herculaneum was to Vesuvius compared to Pompeii, but it was those winds that made Pompeii more affected during this first phase. And I'm not going to talk you through this, but this is a really interesting diagram just giving you a bit more information about what a Plinian eruption is, what it looks like, and how it might have affected the people living in the shadow of Vesuvius. So we said there are two phases of the eruption. So the second phase is the Pelian phase. And you can see in the background here, this phase is really defined by the avalanches of volcanic material cascading down the side of the mountain. So approximately between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. of the 25th of August, the first two of 6 lethal pyroclastic avalanches, known as surges and flows, and these were only seconds apart, swept down the south and west flanks of the volcano. So the surges were composed of billowing ash and superheated gases. It's believed these varied somewhere between 100 and 400 degrees Celsius and were travelling at about 200 kilometres an hour. The flows were much slower. So these were denser, ground-hugging flow composed of larger fragments of volcanic material. But these were actually made liquid-like by the tremendous heat, and these moved at a speed of around about 65 to 80 kilometres an hour. And these followed the natural topography of the streets of the town. So the surges, the superheated gases, would just kind of destroy anything in their path, whereas the flows would actually kind of go down the streets and follow that topography because they were slower and in essence a bit less powerful. This here is an image from Mount St. Helens. It's a little bit hard to see the volcano in the background, but you can see this cascading kind of cloud looking thing down the side of the volcano. So when we're talking about this Pelion stage. It's really this idea of being like an avalanche of cloud and volcanic material and gases going down the side of the mountain.
One man lamented his own fate, another that of his family. Some wished to die from the very fear of dying. Some lifting their hands to the gods, but the greater part convinced that there were now no gods at all.
So with those winds having saved Herculaneum from most of the ash and pumice fall of the Plinian stage, it was actually Herculaneum that was the first of the two cities to be destroyed. So at this point it had only a thin layer of pumice covering the ground, but it was overwhelmed by the first surge, which is referred to as S1. So this surge blasted through the town with the force of a hurricane. It penetrated metres into the sea, leaving a thin layer of ash. And it's been argued that the presence of carbonised wood and charcoal was generated at temperatures of 400 degrees Celsius. You might remember seeing the carbonised bread from the earlier video on the geographic context. A lot of human remains which have been found have been charred. There's one example in your textbook of a woman's body in which her pelvis has been completely crushed and her thigh bone thrust up through her collarbone as a result of the surge. So it gives you an idea of how hot and how powerful these pyroclastic surges were. Herculaneum also bore the brunt of the second pyroclastic surge, referred to as S2, which was even hotter and more powerful than S1. And it's believed that it was S2 that actually caused the widespread destruction of buildings that you can see at the site today, whereas all the inhabitants had already died when S1 went through the town. So by the end of S1 and S2, those first two pyroclastic surges, Herculaneum was completely destroyed and completely sealed. If you have a look at the image behind you, it gives an idea of just how much volcanic material covered the town. It was covered in 20 metres of volcanic rock. So this just gives you a bit of an idea of the ground level of where the town would have been before the eruption and the level of it afterwards. So while the first two pyroclastic surges completely covered Herculaneum, they failed to reach Pompeii, stopping short at Oplontis and Boscarioli. So it's believed that after the first two surges, there might have been a short respite, but sometime between 2:15 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. at the given times, pumice began falling again at Pompeii, and the eruptive column rose to about 30 kilometres. So to give you an idea of how high 30 kilometres would be above sea level, this diagram here shows you how tall Everest is and how high commercial airliners fly, and so Vesuvius's plume is sort of double the height that you get from a commercial airliner, which gives you some idea of the size of it.
At last, this dreadful darkness was dissipated. The real day returned, and even the sun shone out, though with a lurid light.
So what you've just seen there is estimated to be sometime between 6:30 and 8 o'clock in the morning. Pompeii was hit by surges 3, 4 and 5. The town was completely destroyed and was buried in around about 4 metres of volcanic debris. These subsequent surges and flows also added to the build-up of volcanic debris at Herculaneum. And it was the combination of these 5 surges that led to the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum being hidden for more than 1600 years. Just a couple of diagrams to give you an idea of, again, how fast and how hot those pyroclastic surges were, and the depth of burial of these cities underneath the volcanic material. And finally, this is a really great map. This is also in your textbook, showing you the extent of each of the surges and how far from Vesuvius each of the 6 surges went, and which towns were engulfed by each of them. So look, that's it for the video. I'm sure you're wanting to know more about how the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum met their grisly ends, but you'll have to wait to find out a little bit more about that in class.